Notebooks, they've been around forever. So what's so good about Fabric's notebooks? Oops, I think I might have broken something. Oh well. In this video, we are going to look at an overview of what Fabric notebooks are. A tutorial, you might say. Now before we get into it, let me know in the comments, what is the next thing that you want to learn about in Fabric? Now let's get started. Before we jump into a demo over at app.powerbi.com, let's look at an overview of kind of the definition of a notebook. Why do we use it? Who uses it? And how would we implement it? Now, to start off with, Fabric notebooks are meant for data engineers and data scientists. Data engineers write code in notebooks for things like data ingestion, data preparation, and data transformation, while data scientists use notebooks to build machine learning solutions, create experiments and models, use model tracking, and deployment. Remember that a notebook is a primary code item for developing Apache Spark jobs and machine learning experiments. With Fabric notebooks, we have the ability to get started with zero setup effort. We can also easily explore and process data with intuitive low-code experiences. We're also able to keep data secure with built-in enterprise security features, as well as analyze our data across multiple raw formats like CSV, text, JSON, etc. We can also process file formats like Parquet, Delta Lake, and more using powerful Spark capabilities. And we can be very productive with enhanced authoring capabilities and built-in data visualization. Now the next question is, how would we actually run a notebook, whether you're a data engineer or a data scientist? Well, there's three methods. The first method is interactive, when a user manually runs the notebooks. Whenever a user manually runs a notebook, that notebook would be running under the user's security context. Whenever you would like to run a notebook, you can also throw it into a pipeline, meaning you could run a notebook inside of that pipeline, and that notebook, when it would run, would be under the pipeline owner's security context. The last way to run a notebook would be to schedule it. We have a very intuitive, easy way to schedule out these notebooks, and we can use this feature, and when we do, that notebook would end up running under the scheduler's security context. Now that we have an overview of what exactly notebooks are, who would use them, and how they would implement them, let's jump over to app.powerbi.com and take a look at our notebook interface. I'll see you over there. All right, y'all, so here I am inside of Fabric. I've created for myself a workspace as well as a little folder that I wanted to put my notebook inside of. You can see I have my notebook overview notebook. Now before I select this so that we can start taking a look at the inner workings of the Fabric notebook, I want to show you first how you could create a notebook right off the bat. So the first way is when you're inside of a workspace, you can select new item and you can scroll down until you find notebook. The other way that we can select to create a new notebook is by selecting our workload selector at the bottom left side of the screen. From there, I can either select data engineering or data science. I'll select data engineering for now. And you can see over here in my recommended items to create, I have a notebook right here. By selecting this, this would create a new notebook for me. If you have other notebooks, you can also use an awesome feature called Import Notebook to import those notebooks right inside of Fabric. Depending on the kind of notebook those are, you might have to tweak a few things, but nonetheless, it's a great feature if you have notebooks that you'd like to bring over inside of Fabric. That being said, let's jump back over to my workspace so that we can open up this notebook that we have prepared for this video. When this opens up, the first thing that you're going to notice is I've written out some code for us to explore, but we're gonna hold off onto that for just a moment. The first thing that we need to cover is how do we get data inside of this notebook? It's going to be very, very important, of course. We have a couple of different options. If you look over to your left Explorer panel, you can see that I have a resources folder, I have a Lakehouse folder, and I have a warehouse folder. If I select resources, this is going to give me an option to upload files directly to my notebook from my machine. So next to built in, if I select the ellipses here, then I can select new folder, upload files, copy relative path, and more. If I wanted to upload these files, you can see a pop-out shows itself to us and lets us know that if we bring any files into this notebook, they must be smaller than 100 megabytes, so keep that in mind. However, that's not an issue, because if I go back to my all sources, you can see that I have the ability to connect my Lakehouses as well as my warehouse to these notebooks. I already have a Lakehouse that has been added into this notebook so that we can take a look. You can see here that I have my table section and my files section. I don't have any tables right now, but if I select my files, you can see that I've loaded a good amount of files for us to use here. And when we take a look at the code that I've written for this video, you'll see how this makes sense just a bit more. For now, what I want to do is take a look at how do we get here, where I have code cells. I even have some documentation. Well, if I collapse my files section and go over into a code cell, notice that these are separated by the way that I've defined them. So if I want to add a new code cell, I can simply hover underneath an existing cell and select to add a code cell in. I can do the same with Markdown. So I'll add both of these in. For the code cell, this is where, of course, I'm going to be writing some code. But for Markdown, Markdown is a huge game changer for our Fabric notebooks because it allows us to add proper documentation to our notebooks. This is really important, not only for you and your future self. As you're writing this code, it's good to remind your future self what is going on, especially if you have large notebooks and complex code. But even more important, remember that you can collaborate with your colleagues on the same notebook. So in that case, it's even more important to make sure that your documentation is proper, and you can do this using Markdown. Markdown is a very intuitive way to quickly write well-formatted documentation using a simple syntax. I'll leave it at that for now, and now that we have an idea of how we can add in these code cells, how we can add in some documentation Markdown cells, let's take a look at the options that we have up in our Home tab. If I come up to the top, you can see that I have multiple items that I can act upon. The first is my Save As button. Then I have a Download As button. And then I have my settings. If I select settings here, a pop-out is going to open for me that allows me to take a look at some additional details about this notebook. I can add sensitivity labels. I can add endorsements if I want to make this notebook more easily discoverable to my colleagues. I can also schedule. This is one of the ways that we can run notebooks, by scheduling them, and this is where you can do that. Continuing on, the next important piece of our Home tab is this dropdown, where we can either run all of the cells inside of this notebook, or we can run all cells above or all cells below of the cell that we currently have selected. Moving on, we have a Connect dropdown. This is very important. You can't take PySpark, load it into, let's say, the Note app on your machine, and then just start writing and running Python, right? You need some kind of compute. You need the power to run this code. And that is coming for us from Spark. And that means that we need to create a new standard session in order for us to write some code inside of this notebook. I will select new standard session for now, but keep in mind, you can also use a new high concurrency session. This would be very useful if you wanted to create one high concurrency session that you can allow multiple notebooks to run off of. Continuing on, notice that my session has started, and it was very, very quick to do so. Compared to something like Azure Synapse Analytics, it would take a lot longer for us to get that Spark session running. Here, it was a matter of seconds. So that's a great benefit to these Fabric notebooks. They're very, very, very fast. Continuing on, our next option is this drop-down where we can select the different coding languages that we would like to use to write code inside of our new notebook. We have PySpark, we have Spark, which is Scala, we have Spark SQL, Spark R, and we even have T-SQL as well. Continuing on, in our environment section, environment is a resource that you can create inside of Fabric, and if you want to add your notebook to that environment, that is exactly where you would do that, right here with this little drop-down. You also have a data wrangler. The data wrangler is going to ask for data frames. The data frame is a very important piece of notebooks, not just for Fabric notebooks, but with the data wrangler, we have some really cool features. Your data wrangler is a tool that provides an interface for exploratory data analysis. You can see inside of a data wrangler that you have a library of common data cleaning operations. We can also see inside of the data wrangler that we have a grid-like display of our data that shows us a dynamic summary statistics. We are also able to update displayed data in the data wrangler in real time. And when we do this, this can create code snippets for us in Pandas or in PySpark that we would be able to add to our notebook for future use. So the data wrangler can be very intuitive, very cool. It's a lot more like a user interface type of experience where it's more low code than only code, right? Continuing on, we have an ability, like we talked about at the beginning of this video, to run our notebook from a pipeline. So selecting this button would allow us to add this notebook to exactly that, a pipeline. Then we also have an ability to open up VS Code. So if you like VS Code, this is going to be great for you. Now that we have that taken care of, we can look at Copilot. Now, you do have to have proper licensing to use Copilot, but having an AI assistant can benefit you in great ways when you're trying to diagnose maybe an error in your code, or maybe there's a library that you can't remember, but you know what it's supposed to do, so you can use that AI assistant to help you figure out what that library might be. So now let's head over to our Edit tab and see what else this Fabric notebook has to offer. Our first option is autosave. We can turn autosave on, we can turn it off. We can also undo previous actions that we have made in the notebook. We can copy cells, we can move cells up or down if necessary, and we can delete cells as well. Additionally, you have the option to add code cells below or above the current cell that you have selected, and the same is true for Markdown cells also. You can also clear all outputs. This is a great feature. It can be very necessary sometimes whenever you have a notebook that you've run, it has a bunch of outputs, and you want to clean it up a bit, you can clear all of the outputs. And you also have an insanely awesome feature called Browse Code Snippets. Browse Code Snippets, if you look over to the right, after selected, gives you a very wide array of different code snippets that we can take advantage of, whether it be for visualization or Lakehouse interaction. If I select any of these code snippets, it's going to display that code snippet for me down below, and I can either insert that into my notebook or I can copy it and insert it that way as well. But these are phenomenal snippets of code that can be very useful when you're trying to walk through how to solve a problem, or maybe reach that end goal. Maybe you don't remember exactly the code that you need to accomplish that. Well, these code snippets can be very useful to get you where you need to go. You have this for PySpark, R, Python, Scala, and Spark SQL. So a lot of code snippets for these different languages. They can be very useful. Something else that is extraordinarily useful is find and replace. Find and replace allows you to find specific values or characters inside of your notebook and replace all of them with the value that you define here. So that means if you have a variable that you need to change that happens to be referenced all the way through your notebook, instead of manually going through and adjusting the name of that variable, you can use find and replace to find that variable, every instance of it, and then change the value to whatever you would like. Moving on now, we also have a Run tab. If I select the Run tab, this gives me a drop down to run everything in this notebook, to run all of the cells above or below. We can also see our standard session is running here. We can stop our session if necessary, and we can also add this notebook to a new pipeline or an existing pipeline. Additionally, we have a schedule button. If I select this, this is going to open up the settings that we looked at earlier, and it's going to automatically bring me to the schedule tab, which this is the place that I can schedule my notebook to run whenever I would like. Moving on, we also have the ability to view all runs. So as we run these notebooks, we might want to take a look at their history. When is it run? What happened when it ran? We can see all of that information here. Now let's take a look at our last tab, the View tab. The first thing that you can change in the View tab is going to be your layout. You can either leave it standard or side by side. I'm going to leave it standard, that's the way that I like it. But the next piece that you have is table of contents, and this is awesome, and it also points to why documentation is so important when you are using Fabric notebooks, because it is going to take your Markdown cells and create a table of contents for you. So if you need to remember where something is, you don't exactly know where it is, instead of scrolling through your entire notebook, you can go over to your View tab, select Table of Contents, and just like that, you can go to that specific place in your notebook by selecting that section in your table of context. You also have variables. By selecting variables, you have a window into all of the variables that you have available to you inside of your notebook. As you create new variables inside the notebook, they will be added here as well. You also have a view into all of the different keyboard shortcuts that you have available to you inside of notebooks. And you can also turn off line numbers. If you take a look right here, as I select this, my line numbers disappear. If I select it again, they will be added back. That's personal preference to you. I always like to have my line numbers on. Helps me to identify where certain things, especially with errors, are more quickly. You also have a button to take a look at what is new inside of Fabric Notebooks. So as they roll out, as Microsoft rolls out new features for these notebooks, by selecting what's new, you can take a look at those new features. Now that we've walked through the different options that we have through the Home, Edit, Run, and View tab of our Fabric notebooks, I want to remind you, if you want to continue your learning with Fabric, then check out our free class called Fabric Analyst in a Day to help you dive in a bit deeper and learn more about Fabric. And we also have additional classes like Getting Started with PySpark in Fabric Notebooks, as well as another over 160 different courses that you can have access to as well. Now, continuing on here, the next thing I want to do is just quickly run through some of the common items that you might be writing code for when you get started with notebooks. So let's take a look at what I have written so far. Now, the first code cell that I have, I'm going to run this now. But keep in mind, when you start a new session, the first cell that you run oftentimes is going to take a little bit longer to run. Everything else, more than likely, will be a lot faster. Now, this one only ran in 4 seconds. I've seen it go up to maybe 19 seconds that first time you run that first cell. But one of the most important things that you'll be doing, and there's so many things you can do with notebooks, but oftentimes you're going to be reading data that you have maybe in some file into a data frame so that you can manipulate that data. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm calling and creating a new variable called df, standing for data frame. Then I'm using spark.read to load the contents of my files/holiday CSV into this data frame variable. Notice quickly here that now that I've loaded in a data frame, if I go back up to my Home tab, I can select Data Wrangler now. We talked about this just a moment ago, but we weren't able to open it up because we didn't have a data frame to manipulate. So if I select this data frame now, you can see the user interface that we have. Over on the left, we are going to have lots of different operations that we can load in and use to manipulate our data. We also have a list of all of the cleaning steps that we've done. You can see a summary statistics here that we have for our data, and we have a nice way that it is displayed to us, and we can manipulate this right here. Now, as you make these manipulations, as you change your code, remember that it is going to populate PySpark or Panda code that you can then place inside of your notebook for reuse. Now that we have an idea of what this user interface is, let's head back over to our notebook. Now that we've run our code cell, our first code cell that is loading that data from holiday CSV into a new data frame, what happens if you want to modify data? This is one of the big pieces or big topics you're going to be covering when you are writing code in a notebook. So if I wanted to modify data, there's multiple ways that I can do this, of course. I created a simple example here for us where my holiday data in that CSV file that I've loaded into the data frame, I'm going to call that and then place the data inside of a new data frame that I've called df_country holiday. You can see then that I'm calling that data frame and I'm using the function with column renamed. This is going to allow me to pass in the column that I want to change the name of and then pass in the new name. I've done this twice here by chaining on this with column renamed function, and I'm renaming holiday name as well to holiday. If I run this code cell, I've also added df country holiday dot show. That way I can see what has happened here. You can see for country that has been renamed from country or region to country, and the same thing for holiday. Continuing down, what happens if you want to include a library? You're going to be doing this all the time. Well, we can do this by first running ourselves. Very important. Oftentimes it's easy to forget, even if you write the import code into a cell. All the time I forget to actually run that cell. So just keep in mind here that as you're importing these different libraries, there's a lot out there. This is the format you're going to use. There's other formats that you can use as well, but it is a best practice when you are writing in PySpark or other coding languages that you want to call out the specific functions that you want to bring over instead of doing something like this, where I would just import everything from this particular library. Instead, what we want to do is leave it as exactly how it was, where I'm saying from pyspark.sql.functions, import the call function. Now let's see what we can use the call function for. Now we're going to do the exact same thing as we've done up here in just a different way. You can see here that I am still calling the data frame country holiday variable. And I'm doing the same thing I did before, but I want to rename these columns using the call function. So I use df notation, data frame notation, to say df.select. Then I use the call function to grab the column I'm changing the name of. By doing this, I can then use the alias function and then pass in the new name for this column. And I've done the same here for holiday name as well. And if I run this, we're going to get the same output, except we don't see all of the contents of our table. Instead, because we've used a select statement here, we're only going to see country and holiday. Let's continue on. Another particular action that you are going to be using often, more than likely, is writing data to your notebook. So what I've done here is said dataframe.write.parquet, and then I passed in a file name. And what's going on here is holiday 3 does not exist. Let's make sure that that's the case. If I select my files, you can see I have holiday 2, but holiday 3 does not exist. So when I use this syntax, this is going to create a new file for me called holiday 3. And the contents of this new file is going to be whatever is inside of my data frame. Now, keep in mind here, we can now refresh our files and holiday 3 is going to show up. This is a common thread that you're going to be going down. Maybe you have a CSV file, you want to clean it up, save it as a Parquet file, and that's what we've done. But if I run this again, I'm going to run into an error. And the reason for this is, well, because the path already exists. But sometimes you're going to want to do something like append contents to an existing file. Maybe you want to overwrite an existing file. And so if that's the case, you can simply pass in the specific mode that you want to use as you write this data to a file. I could do this by simply typing in front of my write operation dot mode and then pass in, we'll say, overwrite. By doing this, notice Holiday 3 exists, but I didn't get an error here, and that is because it overwrote the contents of holiday3.pqt with the contents of my data frame. There's also other operations that you can use or other modes that you can use when you're writing content or data to a file. You have overwrite, you have append, and a few others as well. Continuing on, you're also going to want to write data to your Lakehouse. Now we have our file, we cleaned it up. Maybe we want to save that as a table, and that's exactly what I want to do. If I wanted to do that, you can see that I am using data frame notation to say that I want to write the data in my data frame with the mode of overwrite and the format of delta, which is very important because the tables in our Lakehouses must be delta. I want to write this with the format of delta and save it as a table. And you can see that I passed in holiday table as the name as this new table. And the contents of holiday table, my new table here, are going to be what is in my data frame. This is another great use of data frames as we are manipulating our data. Now, as soon as this finishes up, if you look down below here, I'm using spark.sql and then using a SQL statement here. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to take a look at the contents of the table that I just created. And you can see in this very, very nice visual, all of the data that I have here to work with. So that is not only how we can write data to maybe a new file, overwrite a file. We can also manipulate our data using different methods. There's a lot of ways to do the same thing. And then of course, we took a look at how is it that we take our data in our data frame and load that as a table. So there's a lot more that you can do with notebooks, of course, whether you are a data engineer or a data scientist. This is barely scratching the surface. But still, these are operations that you're probably gonna find yourself performing quite often. All right, everybody, so that is going to be it for this demo. In this video, we walked through how do we create a notebook? What are the different options and capabilities that this notebook has to offer inside of Fabric? We looked at its really cool features like table of contents, find and replace, and data wrangler. And we also walked through a quick demo looking at how do we bring the contents of a file and load those into a data frame. Then how could we change the name of our columns? We looked at writing data in our data frame to a new file. We also looked at how we would take the contents of that data frame and load it in as a new table inside of our Lakehouse. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and make sure that you let me know in the comments, what do you want to learn about Fabric next? But I look forward to seeing you in the next video.